Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Jack Stanley, and I'm here with my partner here in crime, Gavin Rice. We're here to talk about history, cutting the grooves of history. We're two sharp needles. Now, I'm not quite so sharp, but he's much sharper than I. But we sit down and talk about some of the early aspects of recording, and try to share with you some of the things we know and try to learn from each other. And also we learn from your comments that you make. And today we're going to sit and chit chat about some of the stuff with Berliner recording, about climax recordings, about early Columbia, and some of the trials and tribulations that took place during that time. So how you doing, Gavin?
I'm doing very good. I'm doing extra good today because in my apartment, the air conditioning was turned on for the whole building. So I'm nice and cool and air conditioned, which is great. And that's good for my instruments and good for me as I am an instrument. So as I said, what were you saying, Jack?
You don't want your seams to crack. Yeah, that's
exactly. Exactly. And we are going to be talking a lot about, of course, Jack's sweater gave it away. We're going to be talking about Columbia stuff, specifically early climax transitioning into Columbia. So Jack has a few examples. I have a few examples this time that we'll display of, like I mentioned, climaxes. And we're going to talk about something that is very specific that I don't want to say has been debated on, but it has been discussed, and we may have a solution and an thing that can be agreed upon within the record. So, Jack, you have the earlier thing.
That'll be fun.
Yes.
Okay.
So you have the earlier thing. You take it away, and I'll kind of piggyback off you.
Sure. Well, going all the way back to the beginning of the disc with Berliner, you had the acid etch disc, as we call them. You had a fatty substance on the metal, on the zinc, and you would make your recording. You would cut into the fatty substance, you'd immerse it in acid, and it would etch, basically, the grooves onto the zinc. Now, this is important because the recording industry for the disc, you always knew how good your recording was. Think about this. Once you immerse that record in the acid, you had the master record which you could play. We forget that fact. And so all of the recording engineers who were working with Berliner could always inspect the recording when it was made, and they would know it would be perfect or not perfect. Everything changes with the wax recording process. Now, the thing that we don't talk about too much with the wax recording process is that it was devised by Eldridge Johnson, and he sold the rights to use the system to the G&T company because they were recording until 1900 using the original Berliner system, and then they went to the wax system, and that totally gummed up the works because they were making lots of recordings, but they couldn't play them back. And so they had to say it sounded like it was good, but you really couldn't tell until you had the whole process done and the physical recording existed. Now, yes, you could play the wax recording, but then you're going to destroy it. So there's the rub, as Shakespeare once said. But the thing is that what makes it so difficult is that there's a total new transition in recording, and they have to sit there and make tests and see how it sounds, and then hope and do a Hail Mary, as we call it, and say, let's hope it came out all right. And so the recording industry changed quite a bit. And in these early days with what would be Victor and what would be Columbia and what would be Zonophone, you have an awful lot of flubs, a lot of mistakes, a lot of problems, a lot of random noises and speed issues. that they weren't aware of because they couldn't tell. And it's a really fascinating thing to see. And that's one of the interesting things about early recording is the fact that it really did not become a more scientific system until about 1905 or so. But before that time, it was a regional hit and miss kind of things with the various recordings. And we will obviously talk about a lot of that stuff as we go along. But Climax comes into the scene in 1901. This is an interesting thing. You know, Eldridge Johnson, of course, had the Consolidated Talking Machine Company of Philadelphia and Camden. And of course, he was busy doing his work, and he was very busy trying to get something to work, a system, a company, a record manufacturing company. So he really didn't have time to dabble and argue with other companies whether they were infringing on what he considered his territory. So therefore, the Columbia Company, which wanted to get into the disc industry so doggone bad that they were willing to do almost anything, and they went to a company called Burt. And the Burt Company was in Millburn, New Jersey. And they made buttons, and they made chess pieces, and they made checkers, and all kinds of stuff like that. And so they took the job from Columbia, but being that they weren't fools, they created a sub-company away from Burt, and that was the Globe Record Company. And the Globe Record Company is the manufacturing wing, it's just wink, wink, of the Climax record, which were totally, completely illegal in every aspect. But you have to remember, Edward Easton is in charge of Columbia, and he is somewhat impulsive. He says, let's do this now, let's try this. And they do it, they set things up, and they come up with their very early Climax records, which are all recorded by a recording engineer by the name of John English. And he's an excellent guy because they make their recordings in New York, and the studio is shared between Columbia and Zonophone. They make both of their recordings in the same studio with the same recording engineer. And so I am positive that there are occasional mix-ups where a Zonophone goes to Climax and a Climax goes to Zonophone because they weren't announced all the time. And of course, the Climax record's very, very important. The earliest Climax records, let's go for early because I know Gavin has late and fascinating. And the late one is really, really interesting because you don't see it that much. This is a very early Climax. And I don't know if you can see it here. If I move it, there's typing here. Probably not seeable here. But nonetheless, the way it originally worked with the first Climax records, it did not mention Columbia. It just basically says, as it says here in the typed raised letters here, it says Climax record, manufactured for the Globe Record Company, and it has the piece of music and the number. After a few weeks of having no label, they started pasting this label on, of course, which gives you lots of information. It says, first off, it's the Climax record. Secondly, above it, you will see G&R, Globe Record Company, and manufactured solely for the Columbia Phonograph Company of New York and London. And that looks very official, but it wasn't. It had nothing to protect it. And of course, it isn't until December 10th, 1901, when we talked about that, the patent by Joseph Jones for wax recording. And that's the patent you will see on these records, especially Columbia records. You'll see December 10th, 1901. That is their big wax recording patent. And suddenly they could sit down and do this kind of stuff to Eldridge Johnson and say, we're legal now and you're in trouble. And they argue back and forth. But here's the interesting thing that leads to the record that Gavin's going to show you in a moment. Columbia was never the best of following through on their bills. They had great lawyers. They had pretty machines. They had not the most stable of management sometimes, but also they missed paying bills occasionally. And so the Burt Company was really kind of pissed off with the actions of Columbia. So shortly after New Year's in 1902, Eldridge Johnson takes a trip to Millburn, New Jersey, and says, I'll tell you what, they're not paying their bills. I'll buy the Globe Record Company. They're happy. It's an albatross off their back. And so he buys it, and then he has all the matrices and stampers for the Climax Record Company. And what he does, he has every one of those stampers retooled with a round circle that advertises his company, VTM, Victor Talking Machine. And so whenever you would get a Climax record that said made exclusively for Columbia, you'd look and say, oh, VTM, Victor Talking Machine. It basically said that this was actually a Victor Talking Machine record and allowing Climax to make it, which is very, very embarrassing. And of course, they worked out their deals behind the scene, and because Johnson had bought Globe for $10,000, and then Easton made a deal with Johnson, and of course they started dickering over who had patents and who had this. And of course, once they get everything set, they take over the Globe Record Company again, Columbia, and eventually just take the entire works and bring it up to Connecticut and make it part of the Columbia Company. Now, the other thing just to mention before I jump over to Gavin here is Columbia was never extremely careful about their records and their stampers, because even after that nasty moment when all of their stampers were basically hijacked by Johnson, they continued to use them. In fact, they would continue to use Climax Masters with VTM on it well into 1903 under the Columbia label, announced it as a Climax record, and marked VTM, which was Victor Talking Machine. You want to talk about confusion? There was a great deal of it in the early days of Columbia. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Columbia after we jump over. I want Gavin to sit down and show some of this stuff and share this really interesting thing. Go ahead, please.
Sure. So I have a later Climax record, which you'll notice has a few key differences from Jack's. So if you notice, Jack's Climax record was quite small. It's I believe a 7-inch, right? 7 or 8 inch. And mine is a 10-inch, of course, later. And you'll notice that the label is dotted. So the label is not solid, and it's a whiter color, and it has the same thing. Climax record, Columbia Phonograph Company, the GR. And what's interesting about this is that it has the VTM, which I will shine a light. And there it is right there, VTM, which stands for Victor Talking Machine Company. I'm going to show it again. There it is, VTM. And this is a hard rubber, I believe. It's no, this is no, this
shellac.
This is right. It's shellac after the hard rubber era. And now, I believe this is 1900, 1901, and 1902. Right now, here is another thing that I am going to show you. It is a Columbia disc record, just shortly made after that one, and it's of course very similar to the Climax, but except it has a full ring, and there are patents on the edge of the label that says patented May 4th, 1886 and December 10th, 1901. So that's how you know that this is made after 1901, and there is a brass ring inside of the spindle, which indicates, as Jack was saying, 1902 that this is from. Now, before we talk a little bit more about that, I want to talk about the differences between patents. With this one, there is no patents on the ring whatsoever, but on the back, it says patent applied for. Right on the back, I'll shine a light. Let's see here. You're not going to be able to read that, but there it is right there. It says patent applied for. Then, if we go... Now, if it's a curve, of course. On the disc record, as the Columbia disc record, on the back, it also says patents applied for, but the patents are on the ring as well. Patented May 4th, 1886 and December 10th, 1901. And both of these have a brass ring in the spindle hole, which is very important to mention because Jack is going to talk a little bit about that.
Well, that brass grommet, as we call it, was a feature that was used on almost all Climax and early Columbias. Now, there's two different variations of the early Columbia. I pulled this out, and it's not the one I wanted to use, but you can have a Columbia like this. Now, you'll notice that the brass grommet is here, but there are the patents, of course. Interesting thing. When they first started using that Columbia label with the solid ring, they didn't have any patent information at all. And that has made me think and wonder about when Columbia records were first produced. I personally believe, and I can't prove it, because the problem with the Columbia Company is that their early records don't exist. And so it's kind of like hit or miss, and where we all learn by looking at various examples. But you will notice that the transition label, which I like to call the Columbia without patents, a solid ring around. It's just the silver ring. That, I believe, is the first Columbia label, and probably came out possibly as early as like December of like 1901, possibly early 1902. But we often hear in histories that the Columbia record replaces the Climax record. I think it was a very slow transition. And I think because you have to remember, you have to create a catalog of records. And that doesn't happen in a day. And so I believe that many of the recordings that might have been earmarked for Climax went to Columbia, because sometimes they don't have announcements. If it's an instrumental piece, it just tells you what it is. Other times there will be announcements. And so it's a very kind of, I think, iffy thing. And I have had Climax records where they're announced as Columbia records, and I have Columbia records where they're announced as Climax records, or other recordings put out by Columbia or Climax where they announce the singer but don't announce what the company is, there's a lot of stuff going on. And there's sometimes very little consistency. Okay, there's a lot of confusion. And I would imagine that first 2 years of the operation of the Columbia Climax mixed in with Zonophone, that there was a tremendous amount of confusion. There was a tremendous amount of apprehension over, like, are we going to be put out of business tomorrow? What's going to happen? What's Johnson going to do? What's Berliner going to do? What's Zonophone going to do? And initially, everything was a little crazy. And one of the things they also had a lot of trouble with was quality control. The quality control for Columbia, especially in the transition period, going from Climax to Columbia, there are a lot of recordings that are tremendous speed variations, pressings that are just pretty bad. And this was all done by the Burt Company. Now, here's the other little thing just to mention before Burt goes to Bridgeport, Connecticut. For a while, in 1903, the Victor Talking Machine Company, its stamping facility, was badly damaged in a fire. That is why the Doranoid Company was so busy. But Burt was also being used. And you will find on Victor records, the really early, very early dogs, you will see occasionally a B on the label. It stands for Burt. Just like you'll see the D on the wax stands for Doranoid. And you'll also see the Court Company, which is also a C. So you'll see these little variations and little marks. But Columbia, being Columbia, they decided when Victor was using the Burt Company, they announced that that since they pretty much owned the company, they announced that they were manufacturing Victor records. And so they were advertising that fact, and Johnson immediately stopped his contract with Burt because that made Victor look cheap. And the whole thing was, as we well know, snob appeal was the major factor with the Victor Talking Machine Company. And the last thing they needed was someone to sit there and lift their skirt and show that they were not quite what they said they were.
It's going back to the, you were mentioning about speed variations and also the inconsistencies. You have to realize that in the early days of recording, these guys wanted to just get as many recordings out as they could to make as much money as they could to fund, the company, and also to get better recording equipment. Most of the recording equipment, even in the Berliner era, was hand cranked and weight driven and not spring powered, and spring powered recorders were even in the electrical era of Victor records and things like that. That's why speed variations are huge, and people need to understand with these records, they do not play at 78 revolutions per minute. They will play as low as 55 to 60 RPM. And if you're confused as to why this person sounds so high or too low when they sing, it's because you need to speed up the record or slow it down. 78, and we mentioned this a lot in our videos. 78 RPM was a concept this early. And actually, 78 RPM, it was not a twinkle in somebody's eye back then in the 1890s to the 1900s. So please take into account the speed variations, and it's very difficult to find it with these records. But please know that it's very important to understand about the speed and the inconsistencies with these records. And it's a fun thing to kind of find. Like, actually, I believe one of these is flip-flopped. I think it's the Climax as announced Columbia, because this is a very late one, I believe. So I'll have to play that back. But it's funny. It's interesting. They were just trying to throw recordings out as quick as they could to make as much money as possible.
They had to they had to replace as many of the climax records as they could. And, the Zonophone company went through a similar issue because they had something called Victor Herbert's Band on Zonophone. There was only one thing missing from Victor Herbert's band, and that was Victor Herbert. And Victor Herbert was not pleased, and he took Zonophone to court. And they were forced to redo a whole mess of their recordings and remove, Victor Herbert's band. They basically recorded over and over again and made mistakes because they were in a rush. Same thing. When you don't take a look at your quality and you want quantity, that's when you start having issues. And you find that quite a bit. Although I will speak in Columbia's defense that I would say many times when everything was right, when the stars were all aligned and all the clocks rung at the same time, they could produce some phenomenally well recorded records that made Victor look like a backwater. That's really quite incredible. And you will notice that certain Columbias, they have much more bass, they have a much more vivid sound, and they're really quite great. But as the old saying goes, when they're good, they're good. When they're bad, they're terrible. I mean, it really ran the gamut. That's about pretty much all I needed to say, I think. Yeah,
I think so too. We're actually almost at the 30-minute mark, which is great. It makes it one of our longer videos. So I think the spring power and our cutting lathe has emptied, and we are going to finish this video on a good note. And we're going to talk about more things. And we actually plan on having Wyatt Marcus on next week, probably on Wednesday. And it's going to be really fun. We're going to talk a lot about the Edison recording project, which Wyatt is running and I'm participating in. So thank you again for watching. And Jack, thank you for your wonderful examples. We had some great examples to show. And I hope to see you in the next episode.
Okay. We'll see you soon.
See you
take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.